Thank you everyone for being here for this session at the Global Media Forum here in Bonn, Germany. For the next 45 minutes, we're going to be talking about digital literacy. And for those of us who work in the media, we know that it doesn't matter whether we're reporting on pandemics or elections, economic crises, or war now, that misinformation, fake news tactics are really successful. They're paying dividends. We know that with many major breaking news stories, there is a flood of counterfactual and conflicting information. Journalists are being discredited and smeared, and the facts that they're trying to report on are being called into question. But I guess what we're going to be asking today is whether it needs to stay like this, and if you're an optimist and believe that, no, it doesn't have to stay like this, well, what can we do about it? So we're going to be talking about the problems, but also the solutions that lie with better digital literacy. And we're going to be doing that with our panelists, who I'm delighted to introduce to the stage. First up, we have Jody Ginsberg. Jody is the president of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Before that, she served as a top executive at Internews Europe and the Index on Censorship, and before that, a decade at Reuters as a foreign correspondent and newsroom leader. Please give Jody a round of applause. Next, we have Ralf Beste. He is a diplomat and Director General of the Department of Culture and Communication at Germany's Federal Foreign Office. He was Germany's ambassador to Austria from 2019 until earlier this year, and before that, he had a long and distinguished career in the German media as a journalist. Ralf Beste, welcome. You can sit there, the second one. Asha Mwilu has worked as a field and investigative reporter at major TV stations in Kenya. For her work reporting on Al-Shabaab, she was awarded CNN African Journalist of the Year in 2016. In 2019, out of frustration, she tells me, with local media trends, she founded Debunk Media, which publishes fact-checking, in-depth profiles with a focus on visual data storytelling. Asha, welcome to you. Next up, we have the European Affairs Advisor at the State Media Authority of North Rhine-Westphalia. This is the state we're in now. Michel Winkels looks after the Brussels office of this authority. In the European team, he is responsible for the topic of disinformation. We're delighted to welcome Michel Winkels. So welcome to you all, and thank you so much. I guess what I want to start off by asking each of you, I kind of want to get to know what's on your mind, and when we're talking about fake news, disinformation, this huge big problem that we have. What about this affects or bothers or preoccupies you the most in your day-to-day work? Asha, let's start with you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and I think this is a really good platform. It's great to be amongst this amazing community of journalists. So when we talk about misinfo and disinfo, at the moment, I'm stressed about the Kenyan election. We have the general election coming up in August, and it's very frustrating to see that for media, both mainstream legacy media and those of us in what is being referred to as the alternative media space, it's almost impossible to cover this election. And that is because this issue of misinfo, disinfo, and algorithms on the tech space have sort of like created this space where politicians can create this parallel universe for themselves, and where their campaigns and their narratives about the realities of Kenyans are being shaped very far away from truth or facts. And I think that's what I'm thinking about right now. And I think we'll talk about it more as we progress.
Absolutely. Different narratives in Kenya. Jody Ginsberg, what's most on your mind?
What's most on my mind is the way that mis and disinformation becomes weaponized and makes journalists unsafe. And we heard from Maria Ressa this morning very powerfully, I think, about how these narratives that are often set from the top then quickly spiral into the discrediting of journalists, and then the discrediting becomes a way to demean and dehumanize journalists. And at the point where you cease to see journalists as a fellow human being, it's very easy then to attack them online, harass them online, and sadly then that quickly also becomes physical violence. We heard 20% of those surveyed in the UNESCO chilling report that was out last year on women journalists had experienced physical violence, and that comes directly from this process where you start with mis and disinformation, but what you end with, sadly, is real world physical attacks.
Very clear line from A to B, and B as being the unsafety or the lack of safety that many journalists face. Michel, what about you?
Yeah, as a representative of a media authority, what bothers me most about disinformation, I think, is the question of drawing the line between what is okay and what is not, because as media authorities, as we are overseeing media, our core business is safeguarding the freedom of expression, and this is what we need to do, and we always need to balance out rights when we talk about disinformation.
Great, and Mr. Beste?
Well, what keeps me busy is finding the right balance in our efforts. On the one hand, trying to fight disinformation, debunk fake news, at the same time contributing to the ability of journalists to produce high-quality news. So it's one side to fight against disinformation, the other side is to find the right possibilities for high-quality journalism economically and politically to do their work, because the world needs high-quality information. That's essentially the best way to counter fake news.
Now, you work in the Federal Foreign Office. If we're talking about these issues that are defining our times right now, so climate change, COVID-19, Russia's war in Ukraine, what specifically is the threat from disinformation on democracies and also diplomacy in the work that you do?
Well, in principle, there's nothing wrong about having an opinionated fight for what is right, what is appropriate, what is wrong. There's not just one right information and a wrong information. There's different viewpoints, and that's what democratic debates are about. So people should openly discuss how important is climate change, what do we need to do, and whatever. The question is, how do we get this debate challenged in a way that people are appropriately informed? And that they don't work from wrong positions that are just based in disinformation. And that's very difficult, trying to contribute to a fair debate without being too intrusive, and governments always have to be cautious not being too intrusive in that, because they would do propaganda themselves.
That's what I wanted to ask you about, Jody Ginsberg, when we're talking about governments. When we're talking about these kinds of tactics, they don't just happen in illiberal places and authoritarian regimes. They're also happening in democracies, governments painting the media as the bad guys. Could you talk to us about how governments are setting the tone?
Yes, I think one of the defining features of recent years is supposed liberal democracies painting the media as the enemy. We heard it from US President Donald Trump, specifically called the media enemies of the people. We hear it in the language used by Bolsonaro in Brazil. You know, it is a frequent motif, and the idea, if you discredit the media, you remove the people who are holding you to account, and then you are freer to carry on with illiberal policies or suppressive policies. And I think one of the clever and dangerous things that a lot of these leaders has done is precisely to sow confusion about what is fact and what is opinion. And I think that's one of the big challenges. You know, Ralf talked about in a free and open society, we should be able to have open discourse. The challenge that we have now is we're having open discourse and disagreement about basic facts, and we need to be able to help people understand the difference between an agreed fact and an opinion, and society operates most effectively, and in fact, it can only operate if we can agree on a certain basic set of facts. This is a chair. When I sit on this chair, it will hopefully hold me up. And that's how societies work. Once you start to open everything up, including facts for debate, you sow this confusion and chaos and discord that autocratic leaders rely on to hold power.
Asha, I can see you nodding along there. Do you have anything to add to what Jodie's had to say?
Yeah, I think just to give like a perspective from Africa, because when we talk about autocracy, I think you can draw from very many examples on the continent. What we're seeing is this copycat phenomenon. When Trump was calling the American media fake news, in Kenya, President Uhuru Kenyatta was calling us Githeri media, which is sort of like a local attonation of fake news. And that was happening across the continent. So when it comes to misinformation and disinformation, one dynamic is that there's this sort of like copycat phenomenon across the continent. So whether it is taking advantage of algorithms to, advance certain political narratives, especially during political seasons, or whether it is employing internet shutdowns entirely, especially in regions where there's crisis, like Ethiopia and Tigray, Uganda during the elections, it's kind of crazy to just like sit back and watch all of this unfold. The only difference is that while in the more developed world, there's some, not semblance, but there's a stronger media. There's an opportunity to counter misinfo and disinfo. It's a completely different reality for us, because before fake news, misinfo, disinfo, malinfo, all the info and ampliganda, is that what African governments did that was very clever is to completely discredit independent media. There's something called elite capture. And when I speak to a lot of my colleagues from different countries, there's not a lot of research that's been done about this, but we all can cite very similar examples of how the elite, especially the political elite, was able to capture independent media and therefore creating this information vacuum. And when you do that, coupled with, social media, a young population, DW talks about 77%, that's the population of Africans that are under 35, mobile penetration getting wider and spreading wider. And then you don't have independent media that can even counter misinformation. It's a recipe for disaster. And that's what we're experiencing in a lot of the countries.
Now, kind of hovering in the background of this whole debate is the talk of free speech and what we can and can't and shouldn't say online. Michel, Winkels, I want to bring you in here. You work for a media authority that regulates content. Some people might be surprised to discover that Germany has these kinds of institutions that does regulate and does slap fines on people that do wrong things online. If I can be a little bit provocative, what is the difference between what you do and what another country might do that regulates what is put on social media and what should be taken down?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question, because I think it is very important to tell people that what we do. And it is, we are countering illegal content, and disinformation as such is not illegal content. So if there is a wrong information, it mostly falls under the freedom of expression. That's why we not go against this content. We would rather focus on empowering users to find out what is disinformation, granting transparency to the users, who is the originator of a message, asking to stop behavior that is inauthentic to get more reach of a certain content, because when we do this, we are entering a field that is illegitimate. And this is not the case with any content, and that is maybe false or right. When we are asking the question of wrong news, we need to empower users to see where it comes from, to gather competences, to debunk fake news. I said it in the initial statement, we are committed to freedom of expression, and that's why we will always put freedom of expression first in our work. And one point I want to make too on that, and this is a concept that we have in Germany, that is state-neutral media and state-neutral media oversight. So we are neutral from the governments, and media should be too in Germany, and I think this is a concept that can help us hindering messages by state actors in order to destabilize or take actions against the society, to manipulate the public discourse.
Ralf, Beste, do you have anything to add to that with the German perspective, but one that is facing outwards, looking abroad?
I mean, we have to be aware that in certain areas of freedom of speech, we have limitations, like denial of the Holocaust. We do not accept that. We don't take that as an opinion, but that's a lie. And that's where we are stricter than others are. We have to be aware of that. We need to communicate that. Other than that, we think that it's in the best interest of every country to have a free and open society that allows people to get access to good information, verified and verifiable one. And we try to do that in our country, and we try to help other countries that want to do that. But I think the key question is really the access to good and verifiable information, and whatever we can do as a government to help with that is what we do. We have these media that are getting government funds, but we try to keep them as independent as possible. So we regulate oversight, regulate ourselves, restrain the influence of the government, so that Deutsche Welle, for instance, can work as freely as they can do, and we live with them criticizing us every day.
Now we have a question that's come in from online, from Kamal Dev Batari in Nepal. What role can big tech companies play to curb disinformation? For example, is Facebook controlling disinformation satisfactorily? And Jody, I know that when we had our chat, if I can quote you, you were cautious at playing what you said was whack-a-mole with big tech companies. Can I get your response to this question?
The easy answer is no. Big tech is not playing a sufficient role in controlling disinformation. And what can it do? There are a number of things, but most concretely, what these companies can do is genuinely listen and implement the recommendations of those people who are experiencing the harm of particular content on the ground. Facebook and others notionally partner with hundreds of groups across the world to receive information about how certain content policies are impacting them, and we've heard about partnerships in the Philippines and elsewhere. But what our experience is that doesn't always, or that rarely translates into specific actions that address the local challenges in each country. I mean, some of these places, you don't even have help desks and content moderators who speak the local language. So how on earth are you supposed to address the harms unless you do that? And what we see is these companies tend to react when they see that there's political capital. So, they've moved to change things around in the US following in particular the January 6th assault on the Capitol, but we don't see similar actions in other countries. And I'm particularly worried about what's going to happen in the coming elections, because I think unless those companies take further action to address mis and disinformation, we are going to see potentially much greater violence around elections around the world.
Asha, Mwilu, there is an election in Kenya coming up. Talk to us around that and what Jody has just been mentioning.
Yeah, I know people talk about Facebook and, well, Meta a lot more when they talk about sort of like the dangers that they pose. There was something very interesting that came up. Mozilla Foundation had this research. They have a really brilliant fellow in Nairobi who's been sort of monitoring these disinformation campaigns online. And TikTok, which is becoming very popular among young people in Kenya, and I think in many countries in the developing world, had these sort of like, I think there were like 300 accounts. They were posting hate speech videos around the Kenyan election. Now, the last time, we've had very problematic elections the last 3 times, some that have ended in terrible violence. In 2007 in Kenya, hate speech, political hate speech led to extreme political violence where more than 1,000 people were killed. And we saw sort of like the same messaging that we were seeing in 2007 on TikTok. And this research showed us that these 300 accounts had videos that had been viewed by more than 4 million people. And once the survey came out, TikTok pulled down these accounts. But it's a little too late, you know? So we're seeing that it's not just a Facebook problem. It's a problem with a lot of these platforms. And you know, pulling down videos is not the only solution. There needs to be a conversation about the algorithms. There needs to be a conversation about content moderation. The New York Times had a story about Facebook's moderation. Facebook had hired this third party to do content moderation out of Nairobi, and they were paying the moderators peanuts. And they also had only 200 moderators who were looking at content that is basically coming out of different regions with various languages. It's barely scratching the surface. The problem for us and our context is that there's no legislation. While the EU is busy talking about these things, they're putting together committees, they're putting together task forces to talk about legislation. That's not a conversation that's happening on our side. And so putting pressure on the tech platforms really, really is the priority.
Okay, so a one-sided conversation that's taking place that really needs to be 2 sides. Look, I think we've well and truly laid out what the problem is. Let's sort of look a bit forward now and talk about the solutions. And Jody, when I was speaking to you, you had a really a great quote talking about rebuilding enthusiasm for fact. So that's what I would like to ask you, Ralf Beste. How can we start to rebuild enthusiasm for fact?
Well, I don't know if there was enthusiasm for that, because when people just took facts for facts, they weren't really sure they were doing something original or something that might enthuse them. It was just a very rational way to deal with facts. So we have to maybe wind back a bit and talk about differences, and that's a question of media literacy, but also scientific literacy, differentiating between facts and opinions and impressions and reality and so on. And that is something that goes into the field of education and dealing with information that is high quality, low quality, and which access you have to that. I must repeat that. I think very many of the problems that we have, and I don't disagree with the algorithm question, not at all, is due to the fact that high quality news is retreating behind paywalls, which is in the economic and understandable interest of media companies, because they need to make money in order to pay for high quality journalism. But there's a lot of cheap information out there, which is in ample supply, which was not there before there was social media, and that's doing the trick. And provoking many of the problems we're talking about. So how do you address the supply side problem of high quality information?
Michel, Winkels, when we're talking about, I think as Ralf just said, cheap information, when we're talking about media literacy, that kind of goes hand in hand with competence. How should we be building that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I want to follow up to what you've said, Mr. Beste, which is we have a new situation in online media, and we need to focus on the user when we address media literacy project. And this means not only focusing on children, but also addressing adults who were aware of a reality where there was quality news and are now in a new situation. So we need to look at the whole picture of society, address them all, and then go to the user, help them if we can. We have a great project at the State Media Authority of North Rhine-Westphalia, which is called Zebra. You can ask a question there and get an informed answer in short notice. And we see that we get many questions by users who don't know what to do, and we can help there. And we think such projects, not only addressing children, but also teachers, adults, and basically everyone is key. And secondly, we need to go where the people are who need our help, because those who come to us and ask for help, they are not the ones who need it the most. So we need to see if we can also address the people we cannot address so far.
I think that what I'm getting out of what you've just said is resilience, building resilience in communities. Ralf, Beste, from your perspective in the Foreign Office, an office that sponsors projects overseas from various NGOs, how should resilience be built, increased in communities, not only in Germany but around the world?
Well, I think that's a country-by-country approach would be necessary, and you can't do that and conceive that from Berlin. But you need local partners, and you have to take them seriously and ask them what is necessary in their country. And then you may chip in, maybe with money, maybe with a few experts, but the ownership in the respective community is key, because they only know what the specific issues in that country are.
Mm. Now, I was just wondering if anyone had any questions that they would like to pose to the panel. If you could put your hand up, please, and someone will come over and bring you a microphone. Yes, please, this man with the bow tie, I think. Please ask a question and say your name.
Thank you. My name is Jargal. I'm from Mongolia. At the level of state, when misinformation comes, it caused a really big problem nationwide. What happened in Mongolia was April 15, senator from Russia, Skasachov, said that the Americans are now negotiating with Mongolia to shift their chemical lab from Ukraine to Mongolia. And it was since March 22, Ukraine, Russia started the disinformation campaign saying that Ukrainians are preparing for biological war in chemical labs in Ukraine with the help of USA and Germany. And 2 weeks that's happening, and all people are worried. Misinformation used for disinformation. So what would be the reaction in such a case? What would be the best action from the government? What our government, we had a lot news, information where we have this lab. People are so much unsatisfied with the situation. But in 3 days, Foreign Minister said publicly that we are ready to prove that we have nothing, no chemical lab. Then it turned out a researcher learned that we have made lab for PCR test that small information became such a misinformation that really caused whole nationwide warnings. So what would be the best reaction worldwide if this kind of misinformation comes from a country like Russia, who just invaded Ukraine and who was trying to justify their invasion?
Ralf, Beste.
Me again. No, I mean, any information needs to be verified. So if there is an allegation that there is a laboratory, it takes good journalists to verify if it is true, no matter where the allegation comes from. Just because it comes from Russia doesn't mean it's wrong. We have to be very careful, not just politicizing everything to that extent that we just say if Russia says it or Trump says it or whatever, it's always wrong. I mean, investigative journalism is all about public scrutiny of government behavior and action, and that's good, and that is necessary for Germany as well as for Mongolia or for the United States. So we have to be very careful in just discarding anything that doesn't fit into our worldview as fake news. That would be working and thinking like the others do.
We have a question that's come in from online. What do you think is worse, the effects of misinformation as such, or the exploitation of the narrative by political leaders to discredit independent media? Asha, Mwilu, this looks like a question for you.
I mean, isn't it both? Because they sort of like feed off of each other, and which is the point that I was making across, that misinformation thrives where there's a lack of independent media, where there's a lack of a gatekeeper, where there's a lack of someone who can be neutral and provide facts. So I think, yeah, the simple answer to that question is that I think both of them feed off of each other. So you can't say one is worse.
You're nodding furiously there, Jody.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. They're totally interconnected. That the whole point of the exploitation or the use of misinformation is to exploit the political narrative to discredit the media. You know, if you can't agree on the truth and you're saying, well, they're not very trustworthy, you create confusion in people's minds that is the effect of misinformation. So I think they're absolutely interlinked.
Does anyone else in the audience have any questions they would like to ask our panel? There is a man up here dressed in black. If we can get a microphone to him with his hand up. Stand up, please.
Hi, Cyril Ma from Hong Kong. Question mainly, I guess, for Mr. Winkels. Earlier you spoke about how sort of your department tries to combat illegal content rather than content that is necessarily incorrect. So I wanted to pose a question there. In Hong Kong recently, with the enacting of the national security law, there are many things now which are illegal, but may not necessarily in other places be considered illegal, such as anything that we say that may be possibly considered subversive online in any way has now been tried in court, and many people are going to jail for possibly just a criticism of the government. And that would be absolutely considered illegal. So if I might be a bit provocative with that, what is difference between in a democratic state like Germany banning illegal content when in other places illegal content could be very much considered legal here? Thank you.
Michel.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for this question. And I think the issue of illegality is of course different among member states. We already see it throughout the European Union. And there is a question of how much can we limit the freedom of expression. And I think we in Germany have a system that should ensure that we as independent media authorities can do this job, that we can act to safeguard freedom of expression. We are not making the laws, and as such, we are just enforcing them. So so we enforce what is illegal in Germany, but we would always put freedom of expression first, as I said, in enforcing those rules. I know there might be different situations in other countries, but I can only talk for the German case.
Okay, I believe we have a question over here. Thank you.
My name is Tai Tai Aung from Myanmar. The organization I work with run a fact-check program and also a media literacy program. But unfortunately, after the military coup, for many reasons, we were not able to operate our fact-check and media literacy program in full-fledged anymore. One big challenges we face is how media literacy and our fact-checking being weaponized by the military junta. So they were using the same tactics and even the same contents that we created for media literacy to discredit the independent media. So we face more complicated cases of not just doing fact check, but also to fact check the fact checkers. So, we were facing this complicated work. So my question is how to prevent weaponization of fact checks and media literacy.
Asha Mwilu, you are running a website called Debunk Media. It sounds like a question for you.
Yes, when I tell people that I work for Debunk Media, they think we only do fact-checking, right? I mean, it sounds like that. And that's how it started. But I hope it can tie the question, my answer can tie back to your question. I'm so tired of fact-checking, and I don't know if everyone else is. I think that we have, of course it's really important work, but I feel like that's what we've been reduced to. And I think it's part of the strategy. We're in this reactive loop of trying to tell the audience, this is real, this is fake. We just should tell stories. The conversation, I think that, I feel like we need to have this conversation about the crisis of credibility, right? Because we keep talking about trust. We keep talking about where should the audiences go. And I feel as a fraternity, as the profession, this is really like the question that we should be talking about. I feel we're in a very defeatist mood where, it's the tech platforms and it's the autocratic governments, and now we just need to fact check. I think we need to do journalism, right? For me, I think that's our superpower. When I talk to gray-haired journalists, they just don't understand this whole phenomenon of, okay, now we are fact checkers, or no, we are constructive journalists, or no, now it's like, this is all part of journalism. You certainly have to fact check everything you do. And so I'm not sure how we're going to address the crisis of credibility in our profession, but I think it needs to be part of the conversation. I really hope I've answered you.
Thanks very much. Does anyone else have anything to ask? Yes, you, sir. You can stand up and then someone will bring you a microphone.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was just wondering because you mentioned that yourself as well, that like reactive measures are part of it, but in the end, like from a personal standpoint, I think that in the end it's not gonna cut it. Like being reactive is fine and all, but in the end there will always be automatic processes of fake news, such as troll bots, for instance, in the internet that are just much faster than any real-life fact-checker could ever be. So do you see this need for like preemptive measures to bar out the possibility of too much fake news actually fostering in the larger space that is today's web.
Jody Ginsberg, maybe a question for you. You consulted on the UK's online harms bill, preemptive measures.
I worry about preemptive measures for the reasons that we've heard here around freedom of speech. I think it's incredibly dangerous when you start to sort of pre-agree a set of information that you're automatically going to kind of pre-censor. And I agree with Asha. I think part of the challenge is, and I said it before, we need to rebuild an enthusiasm for facts and information and for journalism. And we can't, for time reasons, fact check everything, but if we can help people understand that good journalism is about reporting the news accurately, then I think we will go a long way. And we are going to exhaust ourselves as journalists if every time we're simply in this reactive mode where we see ourselves as people who just are there to fact check. And the reason it happened is because previously I think we were probably not always doing our job as well as we could, because we were quoting people verbatim who happened to be in positions of political power without ever saying, this is not true. And so the pendulum swung from us just quoting people who were standing on podiums lying and us not saying anything to us fact-checking every little thing. And I think the pendulum will swing back where people go back to doing journalism, reporting the facts and giving people context around them. What I would say, though, I think as we think about all of this, a number of things come out that I think are true of many panels that we've heard today, including things like representation, who's telling the story, which stories are being told. The reason many people turn off from media, turn off from journalism, is because they felt that the stories that were being portrayed on national news in national newspapers did not reflect their lived realities. And what we need to start doing is investing much more heavily in community journalism, local journalism, building up those stories and telling those stories both at local level but also at national level. You know, people disengage from climate change as a topic because they think, well, it's all over there, it's polar bears and melting ice caps over there. But actually, if we could hear the stories of how communities are having to move because of coastal erosion, or the impacts that we heard on land and from logging, for example, I think we could engage much more closely with how those stories impact us.
That seems like a great point to end on. Thank you very much, Jody Ginsberg, Ralf Beste, Asha Mwilu, and Michel Winkels. Please give them a round of applause. Thank you.